Picture this. It's 1969. A young couple watches Neil Armstrong walk on the moon while their children play with newly integrated neighborhood friends. The radio plays the Beatles. The father just got promoted at a company where he'll work for 30 years. The mother is considering whether to join the women's movement rally downtown. This snapshot captures the baby boomer generation, 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964 who didn't just witness history, they made it. But who are they, really? What shaped their collective psychology? And why do they think and behave the way they do? Today, we're diving deep into the psychology of the baby boomers. To understand the boomer psyche, we need to start at the beginning. These weren't just bobbies, they were a demographic explosion, born into a post-World War II America bursting with optimism and prosperity. Their parents, the silent generation, had survived the Depression and won a world war. They were determined to give their children everything they never had. And they did. Boomers grew up in the first truly suburban America, with televisions, family cars, and an unprecedented sense of security. This created what psychologists call an expectation of abundance. Boomers were raised to believe that prosperity was the natural order of things, that tomorrow would always be better than today. This isn't arrogance, it's simply what their lived experience taught them. But here's where it gets interesting. They also grew up during the Cold War, practicing duck-and-cover drills, living under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. This created a fascinating psychological paradox, boundless optimism coupled with existential dread. Perhaps this is why they became the generation that questioned everything. The 60s and 70s weren't just decades, they were psychological crucibles. Civil rights, Vietnam, Watergate, women's liberation, sexual revolution. Boomers came of age in an era when every institution was being challenged, every authority questioned. They learned that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable, and they could drive it. This created what developmental psychologists identify as a strong internal locus of control. Boomers believe they can shape their own destinies. They saw it happen. They made it happen. So what defines the boomer psychology? Let's break down the key traits. First, optimism and idealism. Boomers are fundamentally optimistic. Study after study shows they believe in progress, in the power of individual effort, in happy endings. Even now, in their 60s and 70s, they're more likely than younger generations to say their best years are still ahead. That's remarkable. This optimism fuels their idealism. They genuinely believed they could, and did, change the world. From ending segregation to protecting the environment to advancing gender equality, boomers took on massive social challenges. That's not nostalgia talking, that's historical fact. Second, competitive drive. Here's the hard truth. When you're born into a cohort of 76 million, you learn to compete. For college spots, jobs, promotions, housing. Everything was competitive because everyone was competing with everyone. This created an intensely achievement-oriented psychology. Boomers defined themselves through their work, their accomplishments, their status. They invented the 60-hour workweek, not because they hated their families, but because work was where they proved their worth. Third, individualism. Boomers pioneered the idea of finding yourself. They rejected the conformity of their parents' generation, celebrated personal freedom, and championed individual rights above collective obligation. Psychologically, this manifests as strong personal identity and self-expression. Boomers were the first generation to really believe you could be whoever you wanted to be. This was liberating, revolutionary, even. But it also sometimes created what critics call the me generation tendency to prioritize personal fulfillment over other considerations. Fourth, question authority. Remember, these are the people who chanted, "Don't trust anyone over 30." They fundamentally distrust institutional authority. They prefer to verify things themselves, make their own decisions, chart their own courses. This skepticism shaped everything from their parenting style, much more permissive than their own parents, to their consumer behavior. They read labels, they ask questions, they demand explanations. But the boomer psychology isn't without its complications. The denial of aging. Boomers have a complicated relationship with aging. As the first generation to widely embrace youth culture, they've struggled to let it go. The anti-aging industry exists largely because boomers refuse to accept decline. Psychologically, this stems from that core optimism we discussed. If you've spent your whole life believing you can overcome anything through effort and will, why would aging be any different? Hence the vitamins, the exercise regimens, the cosmetic procedures. The 60 is the new 40 mentality. It's not vanity. It's a refusal to accept limitations, which is very on brand for this generation. Economic anxiety meets entitlement. Here's where things get controversial. Boomers came of age in the most prosperous period in American history. They bought homes for reasonable prices, had pensions, enjoyed job security. Many genuinely don't understand why younger generations struggle in the same ways. This creates psychological dissonance. They see themselves as hardworking people who earned everything they got, which is true, but they sometimes fail to recognize how different the economic landscape is for their children and grandchildren. Not because they're selfish, but because acknowledging it would mean accepting that their success wasn't entirely due to their own merit. The digital divide. Technology has created real psychological challenges for boomers. They adapted to computers and email reasonably well, but social media, smartphones, and digital culture often feel foreign. This creates stress and sometimes defensiveness. Research shows that rapid technological change in late adulthood can threaten one's sense of competence and relevance. When you've spent your life being capable and in control, feeling technologically incompetent is genuinely distressing. So what's the bottom line? What can we learn from the psychology of baby boomers? First, we need to recognize that every generation is shaped by its historical moment. Boomers' optimism, competitiveness, and individualism aren't character flaws or virtues. They're adaptive responses to the world they grew up in. Second, we should appreciate their genuine contributions. The civil rights they fought for, the environmental protections they championed, the cultural barriers they broke down, these are real and valuable legacies. Their psychology of questioning authority and fighting for change gave us a more just society. But third, we need honest intergenerational dialogue. Boomers need to recognize that their children and grandchildren face different challenges in a different world. And younger generations need to understand that boomer attitudes aren't just stubbornness. They're deeply rooted psychological patterns formed over decades. Here's the fascinating part. As boomers age, their psychology is evolving. Research shows they're becoming more interested in legacy, in giving back, in ensuring the next generation succeeds. That competitive drive is being channeled into grandparenting, mentoring, volunteering. The generation that changed America in the 60s and 70s is now in position to change it again. This time by gracefully modeling how to age with purpose, how to pass the torch while staying engaged, how to adapt while staying true to core values. If you found this valuable, do two things right now. First, subscribe and hit the notification bell. I'm breaking down the psychology of every generation, and next week we're tackling Gen X, the forgotten middle child. Second, share this with someone from a different generation, not to prove them wrong, but to start a real conversation. Drop a comment. What generation are you, and what's one thing you learned about boomers today? I'm reading every comment. Let's build understanding, not division. See you in the next one.